Now, the exclusion zone around the plant is, of course, still in place. 20 kilometers from the plant, everyone was ordered to leave a few days ago. More than 80,000 people were evacuated. If you live between 30 and 20 kilometers from the plant, you've been allowed to stay, but you have to stay indoors, keep those doors and windows shut. That apparently will protect you from any radiation. So what's life like inside that zone? Well, the BBC has acquired some rather rare footage from a television crew, a Japanese television crew that was operating inside the zone. Here's Chris Hogg.
A Japanese team makes its way cautiously into the exclusion zone. Minami-Soma is just 12 miles from the stricken nuclear plant. People here have been warned to stay indoors. Visitors make the local hospital nervous. The door is locked. They check them thoroughly for radiation before they'll let them in. Inside are staff who've chosen to stay with their patients rather than flee.
We're not really supposed to stay here, but this is our job. I really resent the nuclear plant.
At City Hall they say supplies are running out and no one will help them. They've been forgotten or abandoned by the powers that be.
We weren't told when the first reactor exploded. We only heard about it on TV. The government doesn't tell us anything. We're isolated. They're leaving us to die.
Those stuck here say they have no means of getting out. Fuel is scarce. Relief teams are reluctant to rescue them. They're refugees in their own country. Chris Hogg, BBC News, Tokyo.
Well, surprisingly, Japan and indeed the rest of the world are very much on edge about the nuclear situation here. But let's not forget the other story, the main story, what triggered this all, the earthquake and the tsunami in the northeast of the country last Friday. The official toll is 4,500 Japanese dead, more than 8,000 still missing. One would have to say that many of those are presumed dead by now, and of course 500,000 people or so without homes and many more without any power.
More people are desperately trying to escape Japan's deepening nuclear crisis. Some multinationals are already pulling their international staff out of the country. Workers are fleeing for nearby destinations such as Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, and South Korea. You also have Chinese airlines adding more flights to and from Japan to evacuate their nationals. Martin Patience has more from Beijing.
Well, the Chinese authorities here in Beijing say that more than 2,000 Chinese nationals have already been evacuated from northeastern Japan. Now, initially, one Chinese airline cancelled many of its flights to the country because they were concerned about the conditions there. Now, according to reports, two other Chinese airlines have put on additional flights to help out with the evacuation. Now, the authorities say that about 30,000 Chinese nationals were believed to be living in the areas most affected by the tsunami as well as the earthquake, and they say that they're taking all the necessary steps to help out with this evacuation. As of Wednesday, we know that 2 ships left China headed for Japan, and they have the capacity to evacuate up to 4,000 people.
Martin Patience in Beijing. Meanwhile, China has temporarily stopped approving new nuclear projects. The government says it will step up safety inspections of all of its nuclear power facilities in the wake of this ongoing crisis in Japan. And China's plan to tighten safety approvals has dealt yet another blow to some mining producers. Uranium is a key ingredient for nuclear reactors, and shares of the world's top uranium producers, including Australia's Mantra, our resources continue to fall. Investors fear that demand for the mineral may be crippled. Apart from evacuating workers, many businesses in Japan are also affected by damage in some of the country's infrastructure. At least 6 ports were severely destroyed, and many more are expected to be out of operation for months. According to estimates, the port's closure could cost the country over $3 billion in lost trade each day. Many roads are also badly damaged, disrupting relief efforts and deliveries of goods in some parts of Japan.
Now, our Washington correspondent Tom Burridge says U.S. officials are concerned by the ongoing nuclear crisis in Japan.
That's right. We had a fairly stark assessment from officials here in the United States about the situation at Fukushima. We had the Energy Secretary, Stephen Chu, who said that the situation in his mind at Fukushima at the moment is worse than 3 Mile Island back in 1979, when one nuclear reactor went into partial meltdown. So a fairly stark assessment there from him. And also we heard from Gregory Jaczko, who's the chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Now, he warned that US military personnel and US citizens in Japan should actually withdraw to a radius of around about 80 kilometers from Fukushima, and the current exclusion zone sits at around 20 kilometers. So I think the United States is assessing the situation in slightly more serious terms, or not serious, but more, their assessment at least of the situation in Japan is fairly serious.
Any idea if the US is planning on following the French lead and actually asking all of its citizens or recommending that they leave Japan altogether?
We haven't had any word on that from the United States government. I think that would be a step much further for the US in the respect that the US military has so many people currently in the country, around about 50,000 US troops currently in Japan. But there is certainly a lot of concern. The US government says it's monitoring the situation very closely. We've had word that they are looking to get more equipment into Hawaii to monitor radiation levels there. But there's no suggestion at the moment that anyone in the United States currently actually residing in the United States is at any risk from the situation in Japan. But there's currently a lot of concern here.
But with 34 US experts landing on Wednesday in Japan, joining 7 others, all with their own American equipment, the US is having to answer questions about whether it even trusts Japan completely.
Well, there does seem to be a slight difference in what we're hearing out of Japan from the authorities there and from this assessment from the United States, although I think it's worth pointing out that at the moment the United States probably is relying a lot of its information from the media and other reports, whereas obviously these officials haven't actually arrived in Japan as of yet. So I think it will be interesting to see once these officials and the experts from the United States government arrive, what role they play in containing or working to contain the situation at Fukushima.
That's Tom Burridge in Washington. Let's go to San Francisco. Emily Rush is from the Californian-based environmental advocacy group CalPIRG even. Emily Rush, thank you very much indeed for your time. Clearly, what's happening in Japan is headline news all over the world, but it is, I understand, in California for very particular reasons. Can you tell us about those reasons?
Sure. I think, first of all, I think here in California are as concerned as anyone about the health and safety of everyone in Japan. But we're watching this particularly closely because we're here on the West Coast. We're in a very earthquake-prone zone, and we have 2 nuclear power plants that are located right on our own coastlines.
Now, in the past few years, certainly nuclear power has become more politically acceptable, but not to you, I imagine.
No. I think Japan serves as a reminder of the inherent risks in nuclear power, and I am asking, as I think most people are, is this type of energy worth the risks? I believe no.
But it is it not greener than, well, for example, it clearly is greener than burning fossil fuels?
I think the risks involved in nuclear power are different. Not necessarily better. Of course, there's the issue of what to do with radioactive waste. But then I think what's on everyone's minds right now are these the risks of a widespread release or a meltdown, as we're seeing in Japan right now.
So in California, what alternatives could you suggest to the Californian government?
Well, in California, first and foremost, we're working to make sure that the existing nuclear power plants that are already here are as safe as possible. And in fact, one of the things that my organization is doing is making sure that we actually have better seismic studies so that we know that we're better prepared in the case of an earthquake. Because, to be quite frank, we already have the plants here, and we have the spent fuel here, and that's going to be here to stay for a while. But looking ahead, we have far more potential to generate alternative, cleaner sources of energy, whether it's wind or solar power, or just making our grid more efficient.
All right, Emily Rush, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Well, let's talk to Tanya Strongman. She's Operations Manager for Save the Children Fund here in Japan. Tanya, how much does the nuclear drama, as it unfolds, complicate matters in terms of the relief effort for an organization like yours?
It's a hugely complicated added dimension, I think. I think in the first instance you're talking additional scale. The scale of the disaster is almost doubled as a result of 200,000 plus people being displaced because of the nuclear situation. In addition to that, operationally it's very complicated. We've got fuel shortages, which we know, and with the nuclear side to limited access and people having to divert to different routes. We had a team went up to Miyagi at the weekend, a 10-hour journey that should have taken them 5. So operationally a very, very complicated situation.
And people, I guess, are constantly shifting, aren't they? Because, they're in one place at the moment, but if the cloud moves, if the radiation gets worse, you're going to have to move them somewhere else.
Absolutely, and we have to be mobile in that regard. And I mean, that's sometimes that is common in other situations too, but with this it's so unpredictable and it changes, evolving all the time.
Tell me, how much does the family structure in Japan, the famed family structure, actually help any kind of relief effort?
Well, I think it does in the sense that in any time when children are displaced, the safest and best option for them is to be within a family unit and to get them within that. So the extended family unit and people supporting one another is definitely a support psychosocially for children in this kind of a crisis.
And yet the level of the catastrophe, the displacement, the destruction is so extraordinary. How would you compare this crisis here to some of the other crises that we've seen around the world in the last few years?
Well, it's always difficult to make a comparison because every situation is different and the context is different, but certainly the scale of this is enormous. 500 kilometres plus of coastline damaged, up to 20 kilometres inland the tsunami went. So that alone puts it in a scale all on its own.
And the insecurity, the not knowing about what happens with radiation must make it really difficult for children, I would have thought.
Definitely, the psychological impact is undoubtedly going to be traumatic for children, and they're constantly not knowing and they're constantly evolving, and their parents being at unease as well is definitely going to put pressure on children, yes.
So in terms of getting closure from this crisis, we're talking about months here, aren't we? Possibly years.
I would say years, yeah, to be honest. It's going to go on and on. I mean, you've got the initial relief effort, and then you do have issues well, we've got children going back to school in a month's time, allegedly. It's going to have an impact on that, and the rebuilding. But then we just don't know what's going to happen with the nuclear situation either. So, ever-evolving situation, very complicated indeed.
Tanya Strongman, thank you very much indeed. That was Tanya Strongman from the Save the Children Fund, the operations manager here in Japan. And as Tanya said, there are so many different levels of this crisis, which, let's face it, is unique in history. This is the only country that has ever had an earthquake, a tsunami, and an unfolding nuclear drama all in the space of a week. And that's why this situation is so difficult to sort out. And don't forget, here in Tokyo too, a conurbation of 35 million people, things could get a lot more complicated.